Did you know something new is invented every 10 minutes? Join us as we speak to the innovators reinventing our world here on planet Earth and far, far beyond. Welcome to GTWN Now, a podcast brought to you by the Global Telecom Women's Network and sponsored by CMS Global. GTWN Now introduces the movers and the makers at the cutting edge of technology who are committed to keeping us all connected. In each episode, we invite a leading expert to share her experience building life-changing inventions in places and spaces that don't yet exist, and the inspiration they must muster to tackle the impossible. We also ask our guests to share tips, tools, and strategies to reach your own moonshot. I'm your host, Rosalia Gitau, founder of Bixi FinTech for Women and Global Telecom Women's Network International Board Member. Welcome to GTWN Now. The Space Race 2.0. The sky's the limit, or is it? Last year alone, global governments spent over $100 billion on space exploration, and the jury is still out on whether this is just too much money given all the challenges we have right here at home on planet Earth, or it's not enough to find us another home away from Earth. On today's episode of GTWN Now, we'll be deep diving into the Space Race 2.0. And here with us to lend his expertise is Jeremy Hallett, the chairman of the Space Industry Association of Australia, who can shed some light on the ambitions, limitations, and opportunities just beyond our atmosphere. So, Jeremy, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thanks. I'm very well, thank you. It's nice to be with you.
Maybe you could introduce yourself in your own words, because we have just introduced you with your very impressive background and bio, but maybe you can tell us a bit more about your journey to space as it was.
Yeah, it's an accidental journey to space for me. The company I ran for many years called Clearbox Systems started in a technology area unrelated to space, but over time we adapted our capabilities to suit space customers. Essentially, we were following customer demand rather than trying to push our technology into that particular market, which is an interesting point to reflect on, I think, as we chat today, the demand side of things. And then from there, really sharpened the way I thought about space as an emerging sector. When I was selling product into the space sector, it was not because we're a space company, it's because we had something to offer that customers wanted, and it just happened to be related to space. But then as I kind of dug into the wonder that is space and all that goes along with it, I got a lot more interested in it, which has led me to where I am today, still working and doing business in the space sector.
Fantastic. So you're basically saying that by default, you ended up in space, and by curiosity, you continue your journey in space. So maybe just for a little context, all of us grew up wanting to be astronauts. I don't know if you're any different. Did you also grow up wanting to be an astronaut?
I did. Actually, yeah. Somewhere in my messy study around me is a book that I think when I was 4 years old, my parents commissioned. You kind of pay those people to do a book about your kids, and it's actually a space story about me and my sister at the time going to space and coming to terms with meeting aliens on other planets and accepting them for who they were. So there was a whole moral to it as well.
So this was, written in the stars, so to speak.
Exactly.
So you grew up everybody grows up wanting to become an astronaut, but not many of us have an opportunity to approach, intergalactic employment as it was. And so kind of I think it's quite inspirational also to talk to people who have fallen into these professions that really pursue passion, interests, and purpose, and see how they happen to come across it. In your case, yes, it was an accident, but to some extent, a little bit written in the stars, and then curiosity really pushed this journey forward. So I think that's a really important message to convey writ large. But that all being said, context. So everybody grows up wanting to be an astronaut. We all just assume, space, we'll just go there and, we're going to explore things and it's going to be this grand exploration, right? But you're a business person, as I've come to learn, and as we've mentioned in your bio. Space is a business. And as we have been watching all over the world, we're watching like Elon Musk and Richard Branson just rocketing off into space. It's not just all about scientific exploration anymore, is it? And, there's quite a lot of market actors going into space. So maybe you can give a little context, like, what is this space race 2.0? Because for those of us who grew up wanting to be astronauts, we thought the space race was just getting to the moon, but it seems to be a lot more than that today. So maybe you could tell us, what is space race 2.0? 3.0? I don't even know where we are anymore. Probably 7.0.
Yeah, progressing through the numbers. The word you used earlier, purpose, though, is a really important part of the new space race, in that in the past, space has really been technology driven, and it's been like a push of technology to drive things forward. But what's happened lately, like last 10 years or so, it has become demand driven and really a pull from users and customers for what space can be done for them, can be used for them, and that a lot of that comes back to that purpose piece is to what is the point of exploring the stars? What is the point of going to the moon? What is the point of trying to launch stuff? And increasingly, the world has got the message right that, well, it's actually about producing those goods and services that are foundational to modern economies here on Earth, and are also foundational to uplifting the way of life of all humanity on Earth as well, that are fundamentally enabled by space, which has become really exciting to see that shift. Space was and still remains essentially a battleground of the great powers in the geopolitical sense. But the trend we've seen with a drastic lowering the cost of putting things in space has made it more accessible to companies and business people who just want to solve problems on Earth. They can now use space capability to do that, where that really wasn't possible before. And we haven't seen the end of that actually flow through the whole space sector and ecosystem yet. Businesses are still coming to terms with this shift, and it's still flowing through their business models and approaching things. And I kind of liken that to the internet, which was built by DARPA kind of for military purposes, and then it was kind of very niche and technical. Nowadays, it's ubiquitous, and people think about what problems can I solve that using this tool that we just happen to have. And space is on that journey as well, which I think is really exciting for what we can do for life here on Earth.
I've never heard that perspective. It used to be demand driven or supply driven, and now it's demand driven. Can you give some examples of some of those or demand driven use cases that are happening now, and maybe a little insider knowledge, what's going to happen in the next 5 years? Because, I want to know where I'm going to put my money.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an interesting one. That question helps me to riff on a thing you hear a lot in industry news is space is more commercial these days, which is I think a slight misconception of the point I was made about being demand driven. I would suggest actually governments are spending more than ever on space capability, but whereas in the past it was about kind of national superiority, now it's about meeting the needs of citizens. And in the past where, owning the value chain in space was really the province of the US and Russia and China and then Europe as a collective, now we see, for instance, in the region I'm in Australia, in the Indo-Pacific, countries ranging from Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines are investing in space capability because they can see the benefit they can gain for that back on Earth. So whilst, yes, maybe they're sourcing commercial solutions, it's still government spending driving that because it's a good and service that they see as beneficial for their countries. And to give you examples of where they tend to range from, Earth observation, and remote sensing, which is using sensors on board satellites to monitor things on the Earth, is a real big driver of the capabilities invested in. But what are these sensors used for? There's a lot of agricultural applications of that. so monitoring crops or cattle and increasing the yields of that. Indeed, it may be apocryphal, but it's said that a lot of the drive for India to develop its space capability was around remote sensing of its crops to feed its people. Yeah. Like well over 1 billion people in India, food supply is a problem. Space can help grow that. Another big one, which a lot of countries are leaning into, is position navigation and timing, which most of us would know is provided by GPS currently, which is a US Air Force satellite constellation. But there are other ways to provide these position navigation and timing capabilities that countries are investing in. And that's encouraging the take up of everything from smart city type infrastructure through to safer aviation, precision agriculture, back to agriculture again, and things like that. And then the third one, which has always been the driver of space capability, is connectivity. Over the next 10 years, approximately 60% of the growth that we see in the space economy, which is predicted to grow from a roughly 700 billion US today to 1.4 billion US the next 10 years. So 60% of that growth is from connectivity solutions. And why space, and why does that matter? Because we're doing it from space, we can connect all around the globe using that capability, and still too much of the world is not connected at all, or not connected enough. And that connectivity brings capabilities such as telehealth and remote healthcare, financial services going down to individuals wherever they might be in the world, and also educational services being able to proliferate to anywhere in the world, which is the foundation of any modern economy, which governments are trying to seek to build up for themselves.
So you're saying my phone bill is going to get cheaper, basically, with the last issue on connectivity?
Possibly.
Get 10 SIM cards. And would you say, just to bring it down to maybe where some of our listeners are really trying to understand, in my day-to-day life, how can space support my day-to-day life? So yeah, my cell phone bill might become cheaper, but I think it was the one we mentioned about smart cities, the geolocation. Are we talking better support for autonomous driving? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so it's ranging from precision surveying, which means buildings and infrastructure can be built more efficiently, which has all the flow-on benefits for, it's a nicer place to live, but also actually climate benefits as well, because things are being built better, through to kind of the ongoing impacts. Things like autonomy are fundamentally enabled by the space capability, because if you want something moving around autonomously, you want it to know precisely where it is, and it gets that information using space capability.
So if I can understand you correctly, the Space Race 2.0 for you is kind of a race among private actors to leverage space to meet a human demand to make our lives better and easier and healthier, and hopefully with more food. And that's the race. And I guess maybe I would ask you, you brought up the internet analogy. Where are we in the space race per the internet? Are we still at a couple of researchers in the UK sending each other, a line of code? Are we at the, pre.com boom? Where are we in that? When are we?
There's been bubbles forming and deflating, not bursting, fortunately, as we kind of progress through it. And probably the easiest way to explain the journey along this is to talk about that access to space issue, which I referred to earlier. Because in the past, pre-SpaceX, which is the preeminent launch service provider, getting things into space was very expensive. It was the domains of governments and very large companies that were normally funded by governments, so basically governments. SpaceX, with their current Falcon 9 rocket, has seen the cost of that plummet such that university schools can develop their own satellites and have them launched within their budgets, which is actually quite remarkable when you think about it, that undergraduate students at university can build spacecraft and put them in space, whereas 10 years ago that was not possible. So that's a massive leap in progress. but the next wave of launch capability has not yet come to fruition, primarily again driven by SpaceX. Their new Starship spacecraft, it will be able to put an order of magnitude more mass into space. And if you take the proportions, that should make it an order of magnitude cheaper again. And so probably businesses are coming to terms with what's coming, and they're redefining their hardware and their business models to take account of this very low cost base that they have in the freight, essentially what they're doing. So probably we're 60% of the way along this journey to see it come to fruition. Probably coming from the sci-fi end of that perspective is what this launch capability has also provided companies to explore is the ability to put permanent laboratory infrastructure in space. One of the last frontiers of research and development, whether it be for biology or pharmaceuticals or food security or modern manufacturing, is in microgravity.
Yes.
And it's now cheap, relatively speaking, to put things in orbit in microgravity to conduct experiments. And so we will see from about the end of this decade, so from around 2030, commercial companies having permanent laboratory presence in low Earth orbit, conducting experiments in microgravity, which I believe will unlock the next wave of revolution, whether it's for drugs or for food security or for modern materials, which is actually probably the most exciting thing about where we're seeing space head.
That is phenomenal. in the next 10 years, not even. It's, you said before the end of the decade. That's the next 5 years.
Exactly. And let me give you an example. So it happens already today because we have the International Space Station, which is actually humanity's preeminent laboratory. But astronauts don't go to the space station just because it's fun to be in space. Yeah. I'm sure it is fun for them. But while they're there, they spend their whole time doing science or technology demonstrations in microgravity. And a great example that I love is was a German astronaut who was in space for nearly 200 days on the space station. And most of his time there was spent on mixing concrete in zero gravity, which sounds really odd. The German government spent millions and millions of dollars to put an astronaut in space who mainly spent their time mixing concrete. But the reason is that concrete manufacturing actually generates close to 10% of the world's carbon emissions. It's an incredibly carbon intensive activity. If you think about the infrastructure being built around the world, it kind of makes sense. That's what's happening there. And what's been discovered is that mixing all the elements that make up concrete actually forms quite an inefficient mixture. And it's very hard to model and simulate that in gravity conditions. So they were mixing it in microgravity and came up with some techniques to mix it better, which they believe, if they can replicate that here on Earth, will cut those emissions by half. So 4% drop in global carbon emissions, which is actually more than the aviation sector in total, if that was to be achieved. So that's why we're ambitious to do things in microgravity, because it can unlock capabilities back here on Earth that are revolutionary.
So I fancy myself pretty up to date on things, and I'm sure anybody listening to a podcast made by the Global Telecom Women's Network also. This is remarkable. Why isn't this on the front page of every single newspaper?
Yes, we need more storytellers in space. It kind of comes with the territory of it being a technology driven rather than demand pull sector for so long. It's a sector full of scientists and engineers. With no disrespect to scientists and engineers, they're very good at building things and widgets, but it's part of the sector's journey. You know, that 60% number I said, I talked about the launch element, but the sector needs to mature as a whole to be communicating that better. And we've not done a good job to date doing that, getting everyday men and women understanding the impact of space capability on their lives here on Earth. And I try very hard to communicate that. It's almost one person at a time you need to convince of the benefits of it. And I think we're making good progress.
I think you've done a phenomenal job communicating use cases and applicability in this call. I mean, you just basically said I could hit the 2030 targets for, the Copenhagen Agreement by mixing concrete in space. That's kind of incredible.
It
So,
is. It is.
okay.
And climate actually has become a key driver for why many governments are investing in space. You hear it from the NASA administrator, Bill Nelson, and Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy describe NASA now as a climate agency because of significant, basically most of the metrics that you need to monitor and therefore mitigate the effects of climate
Yes.
change are collected from space. Like NASA publishes incredible data about rising sea levels, all of which is collected from space. The best way to monitor methane emissions, which is probably the worst of the greenhouse gases, is from space. And we're only just now starting to get some of these capabilities on orbit. Take the methane monitoring example that are revealing previously either unreported, and I mean nefariously unreported industrial scale methane emissions, or just methane emissions that were not realized that can be corrected.
Yeah.
We're only just scratching the surface of these benefits, particularly when it comes to mitigating and then hopefully correcting climate change.
Again, another perspective, use case of we create these international accords and say, it's difficult for the enforcement angle, obviously, because we don't have one centralized government. But I guess, yeah, from a different perspective, i.e., one from space, one can see good actors, bad actors, and room for improvement. That is really phenomenal. So, you'd mentioned that we need more storytellers in this, and that you are one storyteller quite actively going from place to place and telling the story. So maybe you can elaborate more about what is the role of the Space Industry Association of Australia. What is its current role? What role does it play in Space 2.0? And what role does it see itself playing in, on the supply or demand side?
Yeah, so the Space Industry Association of Australia is the peak body for space in Australia. It's a membership-based organisation of over 80 corporate members that range from very large global aerospace prime contractors through to 10-person startups. We have companies that are manufacturing and launching rockets through to law firms. We have manufacturing companies, electronics, carbon composites, lubricants, and then even academic institutions and some government entities that are members, which is quite a broad and deep cross-section of any sector, and certainly of the space sector, which we're very proud of representing, but is a big responsibility as well. And it kind of helps us focus on one of our key activities, both domestically and internationally, which is to my point about how we're trying to drive the space sector to be more ubiquitous. It needs to get beyond being just engineers and scientists and being that typical broad and deep sector that you might see with all the different professions and vocations participating in it. And so we spend a lot of time with our members devising approaches for how to get more people into the space sector that aren't space people, because you don't need to be a space person to work in the space sector. A lot, apart from the engineers and scientists, we need lots of business people. We need lots of accountants. We need lots of people in marketing. Back to my storytelling point, we need lots of lawyers as well. And so it's an incredible opportunity for people across the economy to get involved in a sector that's growing fast and actually having an outsized impact on the earth. So we spend a lot of time from the business perspective, firstly reminding our members that they need to have quite a broad workforce for what they're trying to achieve, but then communicating that more broadly into the public and into other sectors to try and attract people to work in the sector. Hand in hand with that, domestically here in Australia, we're the go-to voice for government at the political level, at the bureaucratic level, and also the military side of things for space and the space sector being represented in those forums, which is important, and also the media as well. And that provides an incredible opportunity for us to explain why space. And really, our big message is that we're not interested in space as a tool of industrial policy, even though we're an industry association. we really call on the Australian government and other governments to remain committed to articulating how they see space being beneficial for delivering on their priorities. And my ideal government policy is to solve a particular issue that just so happens to need space capability to deliver on that, and that government can recognise that in the formulation of their policy and their strategy, and that industry can get behind that and support it. And a great example, back to methane monitoring I mentioned before, the Australian government has recently formed a working group chaired by the Australian chief scientist to revise the mechanisms by which the government wants to accept methane emission monitoring, which is essentially today it's a statistical model basically with very little raw data going in, and they want to transition it to being basically built solely on raw data. You read the whole announcement about this, talks about climate, the environment, monitoring methane. For us, that is a space policy announcement, because as I said before,
Absolutely.
that can only be done by space capability. So the two things go hand in hand.
So where is the space policy announcement or the space announcement? I mean, to your point, you tell me this and I'm like, the headline is emissions can be cut by half from space experiment. But instead, when we think methane, we think of a certain animal emitting, noxious air into the atmosphere. And I think, to your point, I think you're absolutely right. Like so many of even just this brief conversation we're having it's so pertinent to the everyday lives of people here on Earth. And it really just needs it's almost lacking a reframing. So maybe I could ask you, you've elucidated a couple of these examples that are so astounding. What are some other things that are happening in space that you think could fill an exigent gap here on Earth? Like maybe I can phrase it differently. What are the top 3 problems that human beings are facing in their day-to-day lives right now that you think could be supported, fixed, ameliorated by more actors, more space involvement?
Oh, top 3. I think the first one, I'll come back to connectivity, and it's particularly pertinent in Australia, but the examples are relevant, say, in the Indo-Pacific, particularly South Pacific Islands, which are so remote. It's literally been only in the last decade that some remote communities' education of kids has shifted from being a voice-only system via traditional kind of two-way radio services. Think CB radios, super crackly. Imagine having to do school like that. That has only really shifted in the last 10 years in Australia to being full video kind of teaching to remote locations. And that is all being done over satellite now. And Australia is quite a well-developed economy, and we've only just sorted this out in the last 10 years. And I extend that to, sorry, small child. And I extend that to, say, the rest of the Indo-Pacific, where economies are growing rapidly and they're trying to figure out how to connect all their people for these sorts of services. That is probably the big one where space can make a difference overnight through those connectivity solutions. Education being one of them. Financial services is a massive one. Being able to have independent management of your own finances at any time is something I take for granted on my phone with internet banking now. Most of the world still doesn't have that. And so the connectivity at any location on Earth unlocks that. And then the final one is healthcare. In a similar way, my education example was two-way radio for education, moving to video. Like telehealth has shifted to those remote and previously disconnected locations. So I think the connectivity area is where space is going to be filling the biggest gap, even in the next 5 years. And that is like the perfect example where I'm talking is turned into demand-driven, enabled by the ubiquity of what space capability has become. It's cheap to do it. What are the demands we have for these things? Let's bring those two things together and provide a business offering, or in a lot of cases, actually a government offering to their citizens. The next one is probably looking a bit further ahead. Like, it's the food security issue globally is certainly in Australia underreported. We have a wide brown land that grows a lot of wheat. We have a lot of cattle. We have a lot of sheep. A lot of fruit and vegetables grown. We're self-sufficient food-wise in Australia. But even with the effects of climate change, we see, and not just like increased heat causing crop yields to grow, but also natural disasters, whether it be floods or fires, or even pestilence. The ability to develop new variants of plants and crops in the microgravity environment to then reproduce that back here on space is going to be a powerful change for food security. It's hard to explain how much easier it is to do these experiments in microgravity to develop new techniques for growing food that then we can replicate back on Earth. And I think that's a massive one that we're going to see unlocked, which will help economies all across the world developing as well. And the final one, I've talked kind of a lot of humanity-based examples. It can't be overlooked, the geostrategic competition in space currently, and humanity's role beyond Earth and toward the moon and beyond. And it's interesting to reflect on what the other part of the space race that's really reignited, which is essentially between a US-led effort to get to the moon again and then to Mars, and a Chinese-led effort to establish a presence on the moon as well. Often at the science level, they interact cooperatively, but there is a massive national and economic security element that underpins all of that. That's another area where that is solely space. It's a competition in space. And it's important to highlight because it doesn't get articulated much to the general public. And it doesn't get tied much to all those benefits I mentioned about space, but it's really important that that competition doesn't get out of hand and put our access to space at risk. If it's technology competition, that's fine. If it turns into a state-on-state warfare type competition, that's not good, because all the civilian applications of space become at risk because of that.
So Star Wars, got it.
Hopefully not. Yes.
That's such an interesting story to tell. So there's two parts, which is kind of almost like the humanism aspect. So how we connect to each other, and just a back note, I used to work in humanitarian assistance. I spent 10 years of my life working for the United Nations and mainly in communities that had no internet access. I spent time in the Pacific, where quite literally to get to one of the communities that I had to get to for disaster preparedness, I had to take a boat, and go 3 hours due west, stunning parts of the world. Connectivity is leave something for the imagination. But, obviously so many lives could be improved with that. And fun fact, now my day job is actually running a fintech for women so that we can have our own access to financial support, literacy, and financial services, because there is this gender divide in wealth distribution globally. Hate to say it, but it's there. So I think it's really interesting that you pointed to those two instances specifically in vis-a-vis connectivity, and then of course, Space Wars, Star Wars. So, stay tuned. But perhaps this segues nicely into, I really wanted to ask about the gender dimension to Space Race 2.0. What's the role of women? What role are they currently playing? Where do you see them playing? And why I'm asking this is not just, tick box diversity, and inclusion. I recall there was, it was as recently as, I think it was an article, it was in the New York Times. I gave it at a talk on International Women's Day a couple of years ago. And basically, it was about, they wanted to send a female astronaut to the International Space Station. And, she went through the training, all the things, and then the suit. They were like, Well, the suit doesn't fit. Why? Because the suit was created for a 6'2", 100-kilo man, and she is a 5'6", 120-pound woman. So, and obviously, like where one urinates and all of these things, quite literally, the space system was not designed for her. And that there was nothing more literal of an example than like space isn't for you, then I literally can't put you on an outfit to get to space. But we see this peppered across the other STEM, areas where women aren't necessarily part of or are increasingly active, but they're not on equal measure. And I'm sure you're seeing the same in kind of the space industries, like who's occupying it. It's so I'm just wondering, what is the current role that women are playing, and how can we be more involved in this beyond just, okay, get a STEM career or get involved in space? Like, what are some challenges and opportunities that are present for women in the Space Race 2.0?
Yeah, there's a few things. That the astronaut one is actually an interesting one to draw out more, in that as we move to a microgravity economy in low Earth orbit, like I was describing with those space stations, and certainly as we return to the moon, and that's likely there will be a permanent human presence orbiting the moon, if not on the moon's surface, and then onto Mars. It beyond, as you said, a box ticking exercise. It's important that when humanity explores the cosmos like that, it's kind of doing it in a gender equitable way. The problem today, though, is in the past, most astronauts have been men. And so all the long-term studies on the health effects of being in space is male-oriented. And so there's actually not enough data yet about the effects on women, which, NASA makes a big deal about a lot of their announcements about women astronauts and first women on the moon, etc., which is excellent from the empowerment perspective. But there is just a scientific thing they're trying to achieve there, is that we need the data. If humanity is going to go forth in the decades to come and have more of a presence in space, we need to know what we're dealing with for all human beings, not just the men that have been there before, which is a fascinating one to consider. And in the spirit of catching up on the data, that potentially means there's more opportunities for women astronauts in the nearer term than men to write the ledger.
Jeremy Hallett, the chairman of the Space Industry Association of Australia, suggesting to shoot women off into space.
Hey, there's plenty of volunteers. Australia just graduated its first flagged astronaut from the European Astronaut Training Centre, Catherine Burnell-Pegg.
Yes.
And I won't take credit for all the thoughts I just shared then. Some of that has been some of her explanations about what she's been trained to prepare for when she goes to space. Is, a lot of the science that astronauts do when they're in space, but half the science they do is actually monitoring the effects on their own body, to see what happens to their physiology under the effects of microgravity in a higher radiation environment and things like that.
No, absolutely. I mean, completely. I was immediately thinking of, bone density is impacted enormously differently just by the mere presence of, estrogen or testosterone. So that is, that's a wonderful perspective. So it's not a DEI exercise. We actually need to send the other 50% of humanity to space to see, as quite literal guinea pigs, to see what will happen to the rest of us. That is, that's
yeah. And if the world wants to commit to being interplanetary, and I say if there, because I don't think anyone's made that decision that's going to be, it means that means the full extent of humanity needs to be interplanetary, which is civilization and all that comes with it, including reproduction and all of that. So we need all the data and science in place before we go off and try and do these monumental things, if I take it to its fullest extent.
Yeah, apparently it takes two to tango, so you can't just leave us back here on Earth.
Correct.
Thanks. I'm glad that we play a role.
The second one you also touched on, particularly in the developing world, I don't think it's a secret, and I'm sure you could provide the statistics better than me, that women are disproportionately disadvantaged when it comes to access to things like financial services, educational services, and health services, particularly in developing economies. So what that means back in where particularly the space offerings are being developed, which is typically in more developed economies, and then that product gets taken elsewhere, is there's an important role for female voices to be leading in the development of these solutions. And I don't mean that in a trite way. Like, I'm a believer that a big part of being successful in business, particularly when you're developing offerings that you want other human consumers to consume, is being empathetic in what you're offering within your product. And so like lived experience and the ability to empathize is really important with that. And so I see my hope is that there is opportunity there for business leadership for women in developing products and services to address those needs in the developing world, and of course developed economies as well, where space capability keeps being picked up, is an important area. And it kind of segues nicely to my final point. Like, you touched on the usual issue that space, traditionally having been heavily engineering and technician oriented, has de facto meant it's male dominated, because engineering and technician studies are male dominated as well. So I guess the takeaway there is that we don't really push for diversity in space from that perspective, because actually we push for diversity in STEM, because that just means diversity in space at that point. There's no point trying to do it sectorially. It should be broad-based with STEM training, full stop, and we reap the benefits of space in that as well. And the final part of that is I was fearful that as space, and this is possibly an Australian perspective, but I'd be interested to reflect on whether this can be transplanted to other countries. But as space ramped up in Australia, there was a very close tie, say, to the defence sector, which is, at least in Australia, outrageously more male dominated. I'm a perfect example of that. And I was worried that even though it was a new sector, we just kind of inherit all of those things from there. But I'm pleased to say in Australia, that's not been the case. And my takeaway from that, and my point being that space is maybe 60% of the journey toward ubiquity, is that that's really early days. That last 40% will be the hard bit. And so the time is now. The sector is open and desperate for people with the right motivations and purpose to drive capabilities forward in space. It's not kind of locked into old ways of doing things. So I think that's really exciting, and I see that firsthand in Australia with some of the best leaders across the space sector doing the best work, whether it's technical, whether it's policy, whether it's legal, whether it's business, actually women leaders, because we are new and we don't have to do it how things were done before.
Oh, well, that's exciting. Like, well, now I'm excited. So I just wanted that really segues nicely into, one of my final questions, but I do want to go back to one question before I get to that, which is, you'd mentioned, I don't know who makes the decision on whether or not we're interplanetary. Well, if you don't know, who knows? So who do you think makes the decision? Or are we going to end up forced into this decision, right? So the top of this conversation, you mentioned all of the ways in which space could effectively help us live here on Earth, help us from not starving to death, help us from not burning to death with climate change, right? But if those don't go as planned, do you think that we will just be pushed in that decision, or are there efforts ongoing right now to start thinking about that now, not just to be reactive when it's too late, but at the outset, really start looking at society building from that interplanetary perspective, right? One of the advantages always, but as an American, one of the advantages that most governments around the world are, we're always envious of, is the US was in a unique position to have people sit down and kind of be like, well, how do we want to govern, right? Like, and write it all down, as opposed to just ending up there. And if we're not making that decision now, like, okay, we're going to be interplanetary, or we should probably entertain being a little interplanetary, or what if we just were interplanetary, and like kind of go through a pretty exhaustive hypothetical exercise. But without some of these frameworks in place, we might find ourselves just being reactive and go, well, let's just wing it in space, i.e. create arguably the exact same system here that got us kicked out in the first place. So I say all that to say, like, so who is going to make this decision? What frameworks are in place? What frameworks are not in place? And how should we start beginning this conversation, or get involved in this conversation, to effectively start, thinking deeply about who we are going to be outside of Earth, beyond Earth. I like it here, by the way. I just want that to be.
Yeah.
It's really nice.
So
here.
firstly, like I am certainly a futurist technology-wise, but I'm also optimistic about the prospect for this blue planet that we're already on. But the fact remains that, there are natural resources that humanity currently exploits for economic growth and just way of life that are finite. And that's certainly something that needs to be considered. Even if we could, correct the effects of climate change, the resources are still finite here. So there's still a lot of time, but there needs to be consideration about, even if we're still living here, enjoying this planet, where are the resources coming from in the centuries to come, that underpin that, is one thing. The other thing I was thinking about when I was talking about doing experiments in microgravity before, at some points you're going to be limited by scale, and it might be easier ultimately to build a large facility on the moon, for argument's sake, than have a space station just orbiting the Earth. And so there are those sorts of reasons why we would consider kind of extending humanity to other celestial bodies as well. There's nothing nearby that we could like colonize and live on in the same way that we live on Earth currently. Like that sort of, unless you could travel faster than the speed of light, which is physically impossible according to current math and physics. We're not going to get to any planets that are similar to Earth anytime soon. But it's certainly complementary things from a resources and a facilities perspective as to why we would want humans to have significantly longer term presence in space. As for who decides, no one currently, as you said. It's a mix of industrial ambition mixed with individual governments' ambitions, and navigating through that is fraught in terms of all the international agreements. So there's the Outer Space Treaty, which is from the late 60s, which most countries have signed up to, which kind of governs behavior in space. But the reality is there are a lot of it is currently being ignored, almost to the point of being so egregious that the treaty may no longer exist. And it's worst case scenario is some country or other does something by the end of the decade which is so egregious that basically everyone's like, all right, we're ripping this treaty up, and it becomes a bit of a Wild West. I'm optimistic that won't be the case, purely for the reason that, as we've talked about a great deal, the whole Earth's economy is predicated on space capability for civilian purposes. And if for some national competition or military reason, someone wants to put that at risk, that's not just foolish for their adversary, it's also foolish for their own country to do that. And so I would hope that would give decision makers pause about overly militarizing space in that way for competition purposes. But as for how we're progressing further, an example, I'm not a space legal expert by any stretch. Like the US's return to the moon and then onto Mars is governed by the Artemis Accords, which is a set of accords that I think has got in the 30s number of countries that have signed up to them, including Australia, which is kind of how they intend to do that from a norms and behaviours perspective. There is also a thing called the Moon Treaty on how the moon is governed, I'll say that in quotes, The US is not a signatory to the Moon Treaty. Australia is a signatory to the Moon Treaty. And there are some legal opinions that say the Artemis Accords are actually in conflict with the Moon Treaty. But Australia has signed up to both. So, and I say that it's not to badmouth the Australian government. It's just like it's fraught, the legal frameworks for this, and there's still a lot of development to be done. And it's probably not going fast enough because the multilateral institutions which look after a lot of these things can't get consensus because, mainly the main big powers in space historically aren't willing to sign up to new norms of behaviours because they see it as at risk of ceding their superiority in space that they have today. So there is certainly a reckoning to come, which I think we'll see it, and it could take, 5, 10, 15 years, will actually be driven by the global population as that reliance on space crystallizes for all the reasons we've discussed, and that the world just demands that their governments do better with the resource. In the same way the world now demands governments do better with respect to climate change. We may not be doing better yet, but we're on the road to get there. I think a similar thing has already started for space with a lot of the lessons learned from climate change, that will see governments stir into action and hopefully reach consensus in the not too distant future.
Yeah, and I was going to say it's also very analogous to the internet, as you said. There is now this growing demand to regulate the internet because it has been unregulated and that's had questionable results. So you're hosting, or rather Australia is hosting, the International Aeronautical Congress in Sydney next year, and you and I have had personal discussions about what happens on day 2. So I would love to hear from your perspective, and maybe you could share with the audience, what is the point of these congresses that occur, and what do you hope is the legacy from the one coming to Sydney, or specifically, and then the legacy from all of these IACs writ large?
Yeah,
is it announced the new space king? Because like you said, the throne is empty. We don't know who decides.
So the International Astronautical Congress as a concept, I kind of liken to the Olympics of space.
So I was thinking Congress, it's like a governing entity of space.
Yeah, maybe. It could grow into that, but it does move around every year. It's been on a trend. So it was hosted in Australia in 1998, and there were 700 attendees. We expect over 10,000 in Sydney next year. So, I mean, that's 26 years, pretty big growth over that time, which is reflective of the growth in the space sector and interest in space. So it is the largest civil space gathering globally. And even though we're hosting it in Australia and in Sydney, that's why I kind of liken it to the Olympics, is that actually we're hosting it in a global city because it is a global thing, and Sydney happens to be a great global city for that. And so it's not just for the sake of Australia that we bid to host it here. It is because Sydney is the right city for the time that the world's at to host this sort of gathering. And there's two reasons for that, which we're drilling into, which may go to the legacy piece. One is that in the same way I've talked a lot about the end use of space capability, IACs in the past have been very technology heavy and remain so. There's a whole academic track to them. But we, for the first time, are trying to bring space-enabled and space-reliant sectors into IAC so that space people can be interacting with end-user people with the technology orthogonal to that, to actually really unlock what the use cases are going to be going forward for space capability. So really, partly informed by the fact we're in Australia, really honing in on the resources sector, so mining, oil and gas, really honing in on the agricultural sector, and really honing in on ICT and telecommunications sector as well. So that kind of covers all our typical space services as well: comms, positioning, navigation, timing, and remote sensing. Really hoping to have strong engagement from businesses and leaders in those sectors in IAC is point number one. Point number two, to the kind of global city element, is the Indo-Pacific is on the space craze massively. Korea has just stood up a space agency, which has got $600 million US funding in its first year, and that's only going to grow from there. Japan has just recently launched a $7 billion US Space Innovation Fund, which is being administered by their space agency. The Indian Space Agency's space budget for this financial year was $2 billion US. Australia has several multi-hundred million into the billion-dollar programs related to space services for PNT and for remote sensing. And that's not to mention Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and others. So we're really hoping that Sydney as a global city actually can be a focal point on Indo-Pacific space capability and space needs, so that the region can all gather in Sydney to discuss that, but that also then attracts the rest of the world to really what is the fastest growing region, particularly if you include India and China in that, in terms of population, economic growth, and technology. So adjacent sectors, Indo-Pacific focus are two really big things we're pushing for our IAC, which is certainly a different flavour to IACs in the past. The legacy piece, though, is an important question. We certainly have some ambitions for legacy from an Australian perspective. We hosted the IAC in Adelaide in 2017, and during the opening ceremony of that event, the Australian Space Agency was announced as being formed by the then Australian government, which is a pretty big legacy of that event for Australia. So we're working hard here domestically to see what we can get from an Australian perspective in terms of government involvement with our IAC. But the big one for us is around our theme, which perhaps I should have started with, but the theme for our IAC is Sustainable Space, Resilient Earth. And when we talk about that, we talk about three parts to that sustainability. One is the use of space capability for sustainable life on Earth, that resilient Earth piece. The sustainable use of space, so making sure we're using space in a way that it can be used by all and in perpetuity. And then the third one, which kind of goes to that sci-fi bit we were talking earlier, is sustaining life off Earth. If humanity is going to become interplanetary, how are we sustaining humanity off Earth as well? That we want a legacy piece out of that. Maybe it's national, maybe it's regional, maybe it's international, to progress the conversation about the norms, behaviours, and protocols about the use of space for those three areas in a sustainable manner. And there's lots of conversations going on with lots of parties about that, about how we pull that together. So that's my big ambition for nearly 12 months' time when we kick off IAC in Sydney on the 29th of September 2025.
This is, I know it seems like a long time, but it's just around the corner.
No, I'm terrified. It's very close.
Well, that is a great way to maybe end this particular podcast, but I am, I've learned so much, and just a couple of, I would say, like, the top line is how applicable space is to really our day-to-day lives, not just, oh, it's applicable in a general sense. It sounds like we could use it every single day, that it's very much still up for grabs. Nobody's in charge per se. Nobody's in charge. There is no one way of doing anything. And, your perspective is very much that everyone is welcome. So I think particularly not just for the dreamers, but for the doers who are interested in maybe making their own legacy, like something that they can leave behind. This sounds like a really interesting sector to be a part of. And that, again, it's a sector that not only wants diversity, but requires it for its own ambitions and sustainability going forward. So I think that was a really key takeaway. There was one thing that you said earlier that I thought was really interesting. It was about, I think it was, you said something emerging. I'll go back to it, but maybe I'll think through it, but I'll go back to it and add it to the show notes. But it was really interesting because you were kind of articulating this is almost an emerging sector. It's really interesting. It's an emerging sector with 70-year-old, roots and history. So I think very, similar, but also analogous, or not terribly analogous to other sectors. It's a sector with quite a lot of predicate actions, a lot of investment already. And so people joining in now, this is not going to be something new, and you're not necessarily going to be reinventing the wheel. You can really, it's almost like you said, it's 60%, but like 60% plus. It's almost at the point of, as you mentioned, a university student can get involved and have a space company at a startup with 10 people. That's not the early days of a sector. That is fairly mature sector. Even on the internet now, to say a university student with 10 of his mates, can have a successful company on the internet, it's still going to pose some challenges. So I'm really excited by how you are framing space. Oh, and the last part obviously is, where's the storytelling? We have a lot of sci-fiers who've projected what space could do, but where is somebody framing and telling these stories here? So I'm really looking forward. I will personally be dropping in on the ISC, and I would like to see how these stories are being conveyed, because it's, that narrative is so critical to the growth of the industry, because it has to some extent defend itself and defend its high expenditures, right? Since it is so government financing reliant, but similarly to inspire everybody to get involved and use all of our collective capacities to really get us to where we need to be, to leverage space for ourselves, but maybe even leverage ourselves towards space. So thank you so much for your time and for your inspiration and for your advice. And we'll include all of the information about the ISC in the show notes, and we hope that our listeners join us for that. So thank you again, Jeremy. Best of luck. Maybe see you in space, but no, see you at the ISC in Sydney in 2025. So thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Lovely to speak with you.
I want to thank our guest for joining today's episode of GTWN Now, and give a big thank you to our sponsors, CMS Global, for making this episode possible. Today's podcast will be available on our website, gtwn.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified when new episodes drop. I'm your host, Rosalia Gitau, GTWN International Board Member, wishing you a week of wonder.